A harem is a part of the house which is usually separate for women in a Muslim household, and non-family males are not allowed to go there. The existence of harems was even seen in the pre-Islamic civilizations of the Middle East, Assyria, Persia, and Egypt. The evidence of harem was also traced back in the early courts of India, China, Japan, and some other countries of Southeast Asia. In the 20th century, harems were common in wealthy Arab households for wives and concubines. By the end of the 20th century, the harem system remained only by the conservative groups of Arab society. From the 15th to 20th century, the large harem of the Turkish Sultans housed several hundreds of women, guarded by eunuchs. In this video, you will get to know about what does harem mean, and the power and role of the Imperial Harem in Ottoman history. The word harem is derived from the Arabic word harim or haram, which means sacred and forbidden. Though this word has a variety of meanings, but mostly it considered by the immediate meaning, as inviolable place, an isolated place from outside for the female members of the family. Located in the capital city of Istanbul, the Topkapi Palace was the center of power of the greatest Islamic empire the world has ever seen. It served as the main royal residence of the Ottoman Sultan for 4 centuries. The Imperial Harem, or the Harem-i Humayun, was the heart of Topkapi Palace. The harem consisted of a large section of the palace, which included more than 400 rooms. Known as Seraglio to the Western world, the harem was the ultimate power symbol of the Ottoman Sultan. His ownership of women was a sign of power, wealth, and sexual competence. Though the architectural structure of the harem was changed over time, but primarily, it was a tranquil world of green and blue-tiled rooms, outlined with gold. The entrance to the harem was typically hidden away in the center of an elaborate royal court, and only accessed by a secret entrance. The women who entered there were rarely allowed to leave. They had contact with the outside world through the kira, women who acted as agents or intermediaries for the women of the harem. The harem women could only catch the sight of the sea and outer world from the windows of this stunningly beautiful building. Normally, the mother and consorts of the Sultan were of slave origin, but not all members of the harem were slaves. It housed the Valide Sultan, wives, daughters, concubines, and the other female relatives of the Sultan. All female slave servants and eunuchs were also part of the Ottoman imperial household. The sons of the reigning Sultan were also lived in the harem until the age of 12. The enslavement of freeborn Muslims is forbidden by the Quran, so these slave girls were predominantly Christians. The beautiful and intelligent young slave girls of around 13 to 15 years of age were either captured in war, recruited within the empire, or sometimes obtained from the neighboring countries. All slave girls that entered in the harem were termed as odalisques, or general slaves of the harem. When the slave girls first arrived at the palace, they would be examined to make sure that they didn't have any diseases or any physical defects. Then they were cleaned according to harem tradition, and also taught how to clean themselves. They were given the finest food, drink, and clothing. Valide Sultan, Haskis, non-Haskis, all other odalisques, and servants of the harem received daily stipends according to their rank. The harem was the center of discipline, education, and instructions for the women of the palace, or who were at the service of the Ottoman Sultan. The women in the harem were more highly educated, more highly trained in a variety of ways than the women in the general society. They would teach about the etiquette and attitude of the palace and court. They were also be taught about religious education and knowledge of Islam. One of the main and ultimate purposes of the harem was to reproduce the future sultans in order to continue the dynasty, because without the reproduction power of the harem, the dynasty would have died. The sultan, as the imperial leader, was considered to be above the society and had the most power within the empire. He was responsible for the governance of the lands stretched over almost 3 continents. The main reason behind the Sultan taking the female slaves as wives rather than the free Muslim women was to prevent betrayal or the leaking of the empire's secrets by the means of the Sultan's family. It was also disallowed, because in that way the Sultan could be tied socially and by blood with others. So, it was exercised to prevent the interference of fathers, brothers, and other relatives of the wife in state affairs. The other reason why Ottomans chose concubines to reproduce was that it gave them more reproductive freedom. And as a mother, any foreign princess or other free women have more rights on children than a slave woman. The highest authority in the imperial harem was held by the mother of the reigning sultan. She ruled in the harem and was responsible to manage the slaves and all other women in the harem. The mother of sultan was likely to serve as a guide or teacher to her son. She usually chose the girl who went to the bed with the sultan. The favorite consorts who also bore a son to sultan became a member of the dynasty. During 16th and 17th century, the title of Haski Sultan had been used for the chief imperial consort of an Ottoman sultan. Though a former slave, but a Haski Sultan had the second most important and powerful place in the imperial harem and also in the Ottoman court, after Queen Mother. She could even perform the role of Valide Sultan in her absence. A Haski usually had their own chambers close to the Sultan's chamber. This title exceeded the other previous titles and ranks which were used for the prominent consorts of the sultans like Khatun and Kadun. The first and one of the strongest and powerful Haski, who enjoyed the supremacy of this rank, was Harem Sultan. She was the chief favorite consort and later the legal wife of the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the mother of future Sultan, Selim II, and the grandmother of Sultan Murad III. She was known as the first in Ottoman history, who broke many Ottoman traditions, and changed the imperial norms on the status of women in the court. Another one of the most influential Haski, who used the power of her political position, was Qasem Sultan. In Ottoman history, she was considered as strong as any male sultan. She'd been in power really for longer than anyone else. She lived as a courtier during the reign of 6 Ottoman sultans, and ruled the empire for almost 30 years. She was the chief favorite consort, and later the legal wife of the Ottoman Sultan Ahmed I. She became the Valide Sultan and regent when her son Murad IV became the Ottoman Sultan at the age of 11 only. Kaduns were the favorite women of the Sultan. Before and after the title of Haski, Bash Kadun, or Kadun, was the most powerful rank among the consorts of the Sultan. As the law used for legal wives in Islam, a Sultan could not have more than 4 Kaduns. Below the Kadun, it was the rank of Iqbal, the concubine with whom the Sultan had slept at least once. These slave women were not needed to have given a child to the Sultan. Many of the harem women were referred to the status of Guzde, means the favorite, who just caught the eye of the Sultan. The concubines, who were not the favorites of the Sultan, became the forgotten women of the harem. Jariye were the slave girls, who served the Valide Sultan, Haskis, Iqbals, Kadins, and the Sultan's children. They had usually grown up in the disciplined environment of the harem, and later, could be promoted to khalfas, which meant they could be earned money for their services. Otherwise, they were also the property of the Sultan and would reside in the harem. Newly arrived slave girls were named as Ajemi, and Ajemelik, and Sakurd. The personal maidservants of the Sultan were called Gadikli. After the service of 9 years, Jariye women could have been freed from slavery, and mostly their marriages were arranged after that. To protect the harem, eunuchs were also included in the harem staff and in the court of the Ottoman Sultan at Topkapı Palace. There were two kinds of eunuchs in the harem, black and white, and their looks and general duties were considerably different. Usually, eunuchs were captured in war or purchased from slave markets. Mostly white eunuchs were from the Balkans, and black eunuchs were from the African continent. Men who had been castrated were allowed into the harem on a regular basis. The harem was guarded and under the command of the chief black eunuch, known as Xlaraga, means the master of the girls. They had their training in the palace. After serving in various positions, they rose in ranks and would have got the charge of guarding the harem. They supervised the protection and matters of the harem women. The chief white eunuch, or Kapagas, means Lord of the Door, was the head of the inner service, and performed as gatekeeper-in-chief, the head of the palace school, head of the infirmary, and the master of ceremonies of the harem. They were formerly the one who were allowed to speak to the Sultan in private. The harem members were of different ethnic or religious backgrounds. They often influenced the Sultan in many of the empire's decisions, particularly in the geographical conquests of the empire. Especially, the ethnic background of Valide Sultan was very important to determine whether the empire will engage in any military conquests with any specific country or empire. The Ottoman Empire is often assumed to be unfair towards harem women. These ideas often arise from what women wear, and their freedoms or lack of freedoms to be seen in public, etc. Though these assumptions were not entirely baseless, but these were created through the Western lens. Approximately between 1533 to 1656 AD, some powerful women of the Ottoman Imperial Harem, included wives, mothers, and sisters of sultans, ruled the empire. They played very important political roles in the history of the Ottoman Empire. This unprecedented time period was known as the Sultanate of Women. In this era, the power of the women in the palace and court grew up to an extent that was previously not seen by anyone. These royal women were guardians of sovereign power. These women mostly trained their sons, and whenever required, they performed as regents, without affecting the obligations of the Sultan. They used the power of the Sultan to rule the empire directly. This harem rule was often widely viewed as the illegitimate and corrupting political power of the Ottoman Imperial Harem. Furthermore, these harem women also played a vital role in the sovereignty of public culture. They commissioned many royal ceremonial monumental buildings, and patronage of many artistic works. One of the most intriguing features of the harem was its extreme mystery. What went on inside the harem? What did the slave girls do all day? Etc. The life and true state of women within the harem is complex, and can be difficult to interpret. There are no authentic sources about the reality of harem life. In the Ottomans' time, no one had written about the harem, because writing about the harem and the women of sultans was forbidden in Ottoman history. The slaves of the harem were also not allowed to speak or write about their life inside. So due to this extreme privacy, no one really knew about the life in harem. The gross misrepresentations about the female slaves in harem, like naked walking and bathing, and taking part in orgies, or many other like that, are complete fabrications. Mostly, the ambassadors and foreign travelers wrote the imaginary stories about harem. Many of the imaginative artwork by the Western artists illuminate the fantasy about the harem, where they showed a lot of nudity, sexual and abusive treatment with young girls. If the Ottomans had not behaved well, or the status of women was that much vulnerable, then how could the women of the Ottoman Empire have made the example of women's power in the world's history? If you take a tour of the harem apartments in Topkapi Palace, you will see the suitable Quranic verses and hadiths of the Prophet, peace be upon him, everywhere, on the walls of the Sultan's sections, Valide Sultan and the prince's rooms, which instructing about the proper conduct of life. As the Ottoman Empire was based on the name of Islam, and sultans of the empire were Muslims, so these type of blames seems to be quite exaggerated. Unfortunately, probably after being locked up in the cage for long, the stories of one or two sultans presented the bad image of the empire. If anyone has done anything wrong because of their mental state, then it doesn't mean that all were bad. After seeing the glory for centuries, the Topkapı Palace was abandoned in 1853, and was shifted to the modern-styled, and more lavish harem quarters of the new Imperial Palace at Dolmabahce. It was the main administrative center of the empire from 1856 to 1887, and then from 1909 to 1922. Yildiz Palace was used as the residence and court of the Ottoman Sultan for the interim period in the late 19th century. In 1922, more than 600 years of Ottoman glory came to an end of what was once the most successful empire of history, and thus the harem too. The Sultanate was abolished on the 1st of November 1922, and under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, it was replaced by the Republic of Turkey and several other successor states in Europe and the Middle East. The last Sultan of the empire, Mehmed VI, was exiled in Malta on the 17th of November 1922. The Republic of Turkey was formally declared on the 29th of October 1923.